Hello everybody and good evening. Welcome to our second Hangout on Air. This evening we're live from London. I'm David Mitten and I'm here with Rick from NGINX. We're going to be covering how to monitor NGINX this evening. So I'm just going to share my slides. You can also go to slideshare.net/server density and you'll be able to find the slides on there so you can follow along. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. All right, so let's get going. So as I said, my name is David Mitten. I'm the founder of Server Density. We do server and web availability monitoring. We look at your website performance from around the world and then get into your infrastructure to help you understand what's going on behind the scenes, generate graphs, dashboards, and send you alerts. The server density architecture is we're deployed on around 100 servers running Ubuntu 12.04. This is across 2 data centers within the US. And it's about a 50-50 split between virtual and dedicated instances. We're processing about 200 terabytes of data a month through that, through processing the data for our customers or the incoming time series data. And this is powered by a stack mostly made up with Python and MongoDB behind the scenes. And our previous Hangout last month was on how to monitor MongoDB, which you can find on our YouTube channel. But we also use NGINX, and we use it as a load balancer to proxy customer requests through our APIs to the back end. We're processing several thousand requests a second through that. We're getting into the NGINX side of things. There are a couple of key metrics that you need to be looking at when you're starting to monitor, and these can be broken down into hold on a second. This can be broken down into 4 kind of main metrics. So the first 2 of these are related, and this is the number of requests that you're getting, and then rates that the number of connections to the server itself. But also important are the status codes that your backend is returning to customers, and then ultimately the server performance of the servers that NGINX and the backend's providing the connectivity and the data, the performance of those as well. So we're going to go into those a little bit. So requests and connections, and these are often quoted as very cool stats, the fancy metrics you can show off and impress with how many requests you're processing or how many concurrent connections you're processing per second. And whilst that's cool to be able to show on high scalability or when you're commenting or showing off your infrastructure, there actually is a purpose behind these, and that is to benchmark your infrastructure. Well, setting up alerts and graphing these is useful just to know what's going on, but the main use case is to understand what your infrastructure can do. And the key thing is to set up those alerts and the monitoring that you need based on the values for these when you are starting to reach the limits of your infrastructure. And this is where benchmarking comes in. It's not looking at what the theoretical throughput is of NGINX or your hardware or whatever it is you've got set up, but it's looking at the real-world performance of your particular hardware, your servers, your application code, so you can understand what the top level, the highest number of requests and the largest number of connections you can serve before the experience starts to degrade. And this is where testing and benchmarking comes in. You want to try and send as much traffic to your infrastructure as possible. And this is essentially through just sending requests through and monitoring to see what happens to the hardware, see what happens to the underlying performance of your application. And that will give you a really good baseline so that you can keep an eye on those metrics and set alerts so that when they start reaching what you know is the limits of the infrastructure, so you can add more capacity or you can upgrade those instances. And the way to start doing this with NGINX is with the status stub module. And this isn't available by default. You have to compile or set up NGINX with an appropriate flag, the with HTTP stub status module option there. But once you do that, then you can just set up a location block within your NGINX config. You specify where you want to be able to access it. In this case, the example is basic_status from the root. And then we're simply providing the stub status directive. And this instructs NGINX to serve that to any traffic to that particular URL. And the default output from that gives you a basic understanding of what is going on your server. You've got those active connections. The current number of connections are actually being served on the server. And then you've got a number of counters underneath. And the key thing here is that the number of accepts, the number of connections and requests that were accepted is pretty much the same as the number that were actually handled. And usually this will increase, and as you serve traffic, it will increase, and it will usually be the same. As you find that the number of accepts is increasing above the number of handled requests, then you can start to see an indication that requests can't be handled properly. And this is because there's some kind of problem behind the scenes, or you don't have enough capacity. And as these numbers start to diverge, that's when you can understand that you're leaving the limits or going above the limits of your infrastructure. Now, moving on from those two kind of key metrics, you also need to look at the status codes and what's being returned by your NGINX backends, if you're using it as a load balancer, or what is being returned to your customers and your users. And these are kind of standard HTTP status codes. And there's four main categories of these. And the first two, the 200s and the 300s, these are what you will normally see from requests to your NGINX instance. The 200 series is a success, everything is okay. And the 300 series are redirects, temporary or the permanent redirects. And this is what you want to see most of within your logs. When you start seeing the client errors and the server errors in the 400s and the 500s, and that's where you start needing to drill down into the logs to find out exactly what's going on. Now you're going to see some of those client errors because that includes the standard 404 page not found, and that is usually useful to understand where people are getting lost on your site or there are bad links and you can redirect them. The ones that really need to be paid attention to are the server errors, the 500 server errors. This helps you understand problems within the infrastructure, whether that is on the NGINX server itself, or whether there are problems with what it's trying to serve, whether that's CGI scripts, PHP scripts, whatever it might be doing, proxying behind the scenes. Then if there's a problem there and it can't service the request, then you're going to get those 500 server errors in your logs. So what you're really looking for is that you're mostly returning those 200 or 300 status codes. But are there any sudden spikes or unusual patterns coming out from the other status codes? Is there a sudden spike in the 404s? Has a page disappeared on in your application due to a bad deployment? Or on the 500 status codes, is there a problem with the backend? Is something going wrong there, which is causing an error within your application? And the way you get access to this is through the access log. And this is the directive in the NGINX config. Allows you to set this up. You can define where you want the log file to be written to and the format. This is the kind of standard default, but there are various different options in the NGINX config documentation that allows you to choose exactly what fields you want to see within that. A nice easy way to see what's going on if you're perhaps in development on the staging servers, or if you want to see a huge volume of traffic in production, then you can simply tail that log file. But it's more useful, at least for the real-time debugging, is to use something like nginx top. And this is a free open source Python script that can be run, installed in any system, and it simply does the job for you. It tails the nginx logs and outputs some useful statistics. So you can see the number of requests and what the status codes are that are being sent back. This is very useful for real-time debugging as things are happening. Next, moving on to the server performance. And this is key to understanding the overall performance of your NGINX server. And it needs to be monitored because you need to know what's going on. And this is where the two key metrics, CPU load average and the networking, comes in. Web servers tend to be CPU bound, unlike databases which are often bound on the disk or memory. And CPU is the key metric when it comes to web serving. And you can look at individual CPUs if you've got multiple cores or multiple CPUs on your server, but a more useful metric, which is the load average, helps you understand more of the load pattern across the entire whole of the operating system and what's going on the server. And this is because it's not a percentage, it's more of a ratio that helps you understand whether processes are waiting for access to the CPU. And as the load average increases, then you're going to start seeing response times increase as well for your users, because there aren't enough CPU resources available to service the requests. When it comes to networking, this is also important to understand. It's not just the throughput of your connectivity, whether it's 100 megabits or 1 gigabit of connectivity, but also the number of connections, because each connection has an overhead and it has to maintain an open socket to the server. And there is a limit. There's a limit on the total number of sockets you can have open. This is pushed up all the time. The guys at WhatsApp had a famous huge number of hundreds of thousands of open connections on individual servers. But this is all down to OS level tweaking, making sure you have the right resources in terms of memory available and the operating system is tweaked correctly. This is where a tool like Server Density comes in to help you monitor these things. CPU usage and load average, your network traffic, this can all be monitored. You can also use open source tools. There are a load available, Nagios, StatsD. These are very popular tools. But to start getting much more detailed metrics out of NGINX, that's where NGINX Plus comes in. And Rick is going to go into a little bit more detail about this shortly. But it essentially gives you access to a new HTTP status module, which goes into much more depth. And you can find a demo on demo.nginx.com/status. And if you add .html, then you get a nice real-time view of what's going on. If you drop off the .html, then it gives you a JSON representation of the data, which is useful for parsing in plugins. And this is where the Server Density NGINX plugin comes in. And we have NGINX standard monitoring out of the box, but today we're releasing a free plugin specifically for NGINX Plus, which monitors that new HTTP status module, goes into detail on the backends, the status codes and requests, and we also have a range of different recommended alerts that you can set up. So in summary, there are those key baseline metrics you have to determine. There's a number of requests and connections, and this is more than just a vanity metric. You have to understand what your hardware and your applications can service well in advance, so you can set those alerts up and be notified before they start causing problems for your customers and your end users. You can add capacity or add additional servers to service those requests. But ongoing status code monitoring is useful. So you can see if there are sudden spikes of unusual 404s or 500 errors and take action. And then the underlying monitoring of your hardware, so you know how much CPU is being used and whether you've got that capacity in place. So combining those NGINX metrics with server performance is the key. And using manual tools like NGINX Top can help you tail the log and parse it very quickly. But to get an ongoing understanding with graphs and trend analysis and alerting, then you need to set up a monitoring product. And obviously, Server Density is a good option there, but there are multiple options available in the community, both commercial and open source. We've got a range of useful resources, both in the NGINX documentation and also on our blog and our website, serverdensity.com/nginx, that can help you out. I'm going to hand you over now to Rick, who's going to go through some of the additional stuff you can get with NGINX and some kind of more best practices on monitoring.
All right, thank you.
So let me just hand you over.
You guys see my screen? You should see a...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So I thought I'd start with, so as David mentioned, we have a new module, the status module, which has a lot more stats than the substatus module he had shown in the beginning. So first I want to show a really minimal configuration of how to take advantage of that. At the top here you'll notice it's fairly similar to what he had, but instead of the substatus directive we use the status directive. And I've set up a server to listen to port 8080, so any traffic that comes to port 8080 will basically bring back the status. For those of you not familiar with NGINX, upstreams is how, when you want to load balance, you set up a set of servers. So I've set up a upstream called backend, which has 2 servers, backend 1 and backend 2. And you decide where you want stats to be collected. This zone directive here tells NGINX that we want to collect stats here. It also gives us some other features, which I'm not going to go into today. And then I've created my main server listening to port 80. And here again, I've decided I want to collect status, so I do the status zone directive, and I give it a name. Again, you decide where you want to collect the stats and how you want to aggregate them. If I made every server give its own server zone, then each one will be collected separately. If I combine them together, they'll be combined. So you can decide how you want to do that. Now, David had mentioned we have this page demo.nginx.com status.html. So this comes with NGINX Plus, and this page is pretty simple. It does has some JavaScript that does every 1 second. It does a request to NGINX to get the stats, and then it visualizes them here. And it's raw data, so you're not going to see the pretty graphs. You'll see a nice tool like Server Density, which is why people like to use plugins to get more useful information, or at least in a nicer way. But I wanted to go at least briefly through the stats so you can see what you'll get there. Again, with the substatus module, you're basically getting connections. And then David will show how another way you can look at log files and get response codes and so forth. But if you're using the substatus module, you don't have to do that. So at the top, we'll see some system information, what version of NGINX we're running, the main address, how long it's been up, and then a bunch of connection information, both current and total, and then a request as well. And then server zones, in this case, again, this is not the configure I showed you. This is a test system we have running. We have, multiple different server zones, and you'll see for each one we can now see the total number of requests, how many are current, the requests per second. Again, the request per second is calculated by this page, the JavaScript. NGINX is giving you the raw data, so basically every time you ping it, in this case once a second, you'll get the total number of requests, and then you can compute the request rates. But again, so we'll see the number of requests. As David mentioned, you have the response codes. We also do the 100s. For those, 100s are not used nearly as often, but they can be sent out there. But we also know how much traffic, so basically the bytes set and bytes received to each node. And then again, this page calculates the rate of those. If you're using NGINX for caching, then, which I didn't show in my little config, you can also, anyone you set up, any caching zone you set up in NGINX will be monitored as well. Again, state is going to be warm or cold. A cold state is what happens when NGINX starts up, and it needs to refresh its metadata for the cache. Once that's been done, it'll be in warm, and it'll stay warm until NGINX were to be restarted. You'll see how much capacity it has in total, how much has been used, and then how many things have been served from the cache, written, bypassed, and so forth. And so this is by request, and you'll see it by size as well. So upstream groups, as I said, are the groups of backend servers that we're load balancing across. And here we just have 2, app servers and demo streams. And again, you'll see information, again, the IP address for them, what their state is, and we'll see things like up and down. Up means it's all healthy and it's happy. Down means I've marked it down. And I'll talk in a second about unavailable versus unhealthy, but I just want to go through a few other things first. NGINX supports weighted load balancing, so you can see what the weight is here. Again, here's the total number of requests that node has seen, its current request rate. You'll see there's not a very heavily trafficked site here. And then the response codes. Again, up above we saw it for the system. Here we see at the server level. Here we're seeing it for each server. Same with connections, the traffic sent. So server checks and health monitors. So NGINX open source comes with what's called server check. You can think of it as inline health checking, and that is that if NGINX tries to talk to a server and it gets errors, and you can figure what those are. Normally it'd be system errors like can't connect. It'll mark a server as down for a while and then try it again. That's what a server check is, and that's telling us how many times one of these servers has failed to check. Health monitor is something new in NGINX Plus, and that's active out-of-band health monitors. So NGINX is actively going out and checking the back-end nodes. And you'll see here that these guys, there's no health checks running here, which is why checks are 0. But this one down here is checking them every few seconds, and you'll see how many checks have been made of those checks, how many have failed, how many times they've been considered unhealthy. Because you can tell it whether one fail is unhealthy, or maybe you want it to fail 3 times before it's unhealthy. and then what its last state is. So you see these passed, these failed, and that's why they're unhealthy. Unavailable means the server check failed. So that's a quick run through of what you'll see here. If you're going to use a plugin, what they're going to see, and David mentions, if you take the HTML off here, you'll see the raw JSON response. Not very pretty, but very easy for plugins to monitor. And so they basically make this request, like Server Density, does this, and then they can take that data in and store it, and again, make the nice graphs, keep the historical information, and so forth. And you could also make requests for parts of this. Say you only want to see one server zone, you could make the request for that as well. So that's a real quick run through of what the stats look like. So I think I'll hand it back off to David.
Okay, thanks, Rick. So we got a couple of questions. So the first question was where the slide's located. So you can go to slideshare.net/serverdensity, and you can also go to serverdensity.com/nginx. So slides are up there, and this has been recorded, so you'll be able to access the video again on the Server Density YouTube channel at youtube.com/serverdensity. So there's also a question for you, Rick. So is there a way to get host name instead of the IP address on the server portion of the monitoring page?
I believe I set them up for IP address, so I don't believe so, and that's because the host name could resolve to multiple servers. To be honest, I'd have to check out and see if you did one host name that doesn't resolve to multiples, whether it would show. I'd have to check that out, but it's easy enough to test out. If you have any questions outside of here, I'm easy to reach. I'm just rick@nginx.com. But I'll have to take a look on that one. But in general, we resolve the host names. Again, it's quite common to set up your pools with host names with multiple back-end nodes. So that's actually how they manage. Using DNS, they manage adding nodes and removing them from the back-end using DNS. That's a quite common way, which is why they get resolved to IP addresses.
Okay. If anyone has any other questions, then you can sign in to your Google account and you can submit a question. Rick, did you want to just mention something quickly about the upcoming conference, the NGINXconf?
Yeah. So yeah, next week here in San Francisco Bay Area, we have the first ever NGINX user conference, and we'll have a lot of our guys. People may not know that NGINX is developed in Moscow. I run the pre-sales team out of our headquarters here in San Francisco, but all the engineering is out of Moscow, and a huge part of the team is going to be in Burlingame next week. You can go to our website, nginx.com, and get information about that. Igor Sosoyev, the author, will be there and giving a talk. So it's a great time if you want to meet other customers or talk to the engineers. Great place for that.
Sounds good. All right. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So if you want to email me, I'm david@serverdensity.com. Happy to answer any questions that come up. As I mentioned, this video will be available on our YouTube channel and also at serverdensity.com/nginx. So I think there's anything else, Rick? Did you want to mention anything else? Otherwise, I think we're done.
Nope, I think we're covered.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Bye.